The 1980s gave us mullets, neon spandex, and some of the most frustrating pieces of heavy machinery ever bolted together. These weren't just machines that broke down, these were machines that humiliated operators, drained contractors dry, and made grown men want to cry into their hard hats. Some of them leaked, some of them wouldn't even move on a cold morning, and a few of them had design flaws so baffling, engineers should have been personally apologizing. These are the 10 most hated backhoes of the 1980s. Number 10. The Ford 555. Early 1980s. Let's kick things off with one of the most infamous names in 1980s backhoe history, the Ford 555A. Ford launched the 555 series around 1980, and the early A model was essentially Ford dipping its toes into the dedicated backhoe loader market. On paper, it looked like a reasonable machine, compact, relatively affordable, and carrying the trusted Ford badge. Contractors saw the price tag, saw the name, and figured they couldn't go wrong. They were wrong. The 555A was powered by a 3-cylinder, 201 cubic inch diesel engine, a unit that would go on to become notorious in heavy equipment circles for one simple reason: it didn't last. Operators across the country started reporting that their engines were being rebuilt at shockingly low hours. We're talking machines that needed full engine rebuilds before they'd even hit the 3,000-hour mark, a number that would be considered barely broken in on a well-built diesel. The 3-cylinder 201 block had well-documented casting quality and cavitation issues. Mechanics who worked on these engines confirmed the blocks were prone to problems that caused cylinder wall damage, and the slightest operational error, like running low on coolant, which happened to more than a few crews, could smear all 3 pistons. Just like that, your workday was over, permanently. When you took the damaged engine to a machine shop, many shops actually refused to bore the 555A's engine block without simultaneously sleeving it back to standard size, because the castings were simply that suspect. That repair alone cost contractors serious money. And this was a backhoe that was supposed to be a budget-friendly option. Parts availability also became a headache over time. When Ford transitioned its industrial line to New Holland, owners found themselves navigating a parts network that required going specifically to New Holland industrial dealers rather than regular Ford ag dealers. For guys out in rural areas, that meant long drives or long waits. The Ford 555A wasn't a total disaster. Operators who kept on top of maintenance and never pushed the cooling system could get decent work out of it. But for the average contractor who bought it expecting Ford reliability, it was a deeply unpleasant surprise. The 555B that followed fixed some issues, but the early A model's reputation was already set in stone by then. Number 9. The John Deere 310. Original 1980s version 2WD. Now, John Deere has made some absolutely legendary backhoes, and the 310 series is one of the most enduring lines in the industry's history. But we need to talk specifically about the early 1980s 2WD version of the 310, because it had a very particular problem that made operators genuinely hate working with it. The word used most often by operators who ran these machines in period: tippy. The early 2WD John Deere 310 had a stability problem. The machine's weight distribution, combined with the lack of rear-wheel drive assist and the design of its axle geometry, made it prone to lifting the front wheels dramatically when you engaged the backhoe under load, particularly when digging or swinging a heavy bucket. Operators who had come from other machines were caught off guard. Let off the clutch too quickly, and you'd find yourself doing something uncomfortably close to a wheelie on a 14,000-pound backhoe. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was a legitimate productivity killer. On slope terrain or soft ground, it turned routine work into a constant wrestling match. The machine wanted to go places you didn't want it to go, and the lack of 4WD meant you had no mechanical way to control that situation. Veteran operators who used both the 310 and the 410 in this era noted the exact same problem existed across both models. Both had that square, boxy cab design from the early 80s, and both shared the fundamental limitation that once you poured power into the hydraulics for digging, the rear wheels were essentially doing all the stabilizing work while the front end rose like it was curious about the sky. And speaking of the 410, which sits at number 8 on our list, that machine brought its own specific grief. Number 8. The John Deere 410 Weak Loader Frame. The John Deere 410 was marketed as the big brother of the 310. More horsepower, more capability, more machine. And it was a capable digger. The backhoe end of the 410 was actually solid. The problem? The loader end. The 410 became known among contractors for having a weak loader frame. Operators who pushed the machine on loading tasks, hauling heavy material in the bucket, using it for pushing work, or operators who were just hard on their equipment, found the loader structure developing cracks and fatigue failures in ways they simply didn't see on comparable machines from Case or other competitors. This was noted consistently enough that even buyers shopping used 410s in later years knew to specifically inspect the loader frame for cracks or previous weld repairs before buying. It became part of the unofficial checklist. Check the pins for slop, check the hydraulics, and check the loader frame for cracks. That last item shouldn't have been on the checklist for a machine this size, but there it was. What made this especially aggravating was that the 410 was supposed to be the heavy-duty option. If you were spending more money to get the bigger machine, you expected the loader frame to handle big machine work. When it didn't hold up, it felt like a fundamental betrayal of the product's promise. The 410 also shared the closed-center hydraulic system that Deere used in this era, a technically sophisticated system that kept pressure on all lines at all times. In theory, this allowed smoother simultaneous operation of multiple functions. In practice, on an aging machine where any seal, hose, or fitting had the slightest wear, it produced what one operator memorably described as a machine that leaks profusely. Old Deere backhoes of this era with closed-center hydraulics and worn components could turn a job site into something resembling an oil spill. Number 7. The Case 580C. Dual boom cylinders and sightline grief. Case built excellent backhoes. Anyone in the industry will tell you that. The 580 series is legendary, but the 580C, which was produced from the mid-1970s into the early 1980s, had a specific design characteristic that drove operators absolutely crazy, and it was built right into the most visible part of the machine. The 580C used a twin-cylinder over-center boom design. That means there were two hydraulic cylinders mounted on the sides of the boom rather than a single clean interior cylinder. Now, from a maintenance standpoint, some mechanics actually liked this. Both cylinders were right out in the open where you could see them and get to them. But operators in the seat had a completely different perspective. Those twin boom cylinders blocked the sightline into the hole. When you're digging, your ability to see exactly what the bucket is doing at the bottom of an excavation is critical. Precision work, laying a pipe, grading the bottom of a trench, avoiding existing utilities, requires being able to see what you're doing. The dual cylinders on the 580C significantly degraded that visibility compared to machines with cleaner designs, and the complaints didn't stop there. The 580C's transmission was not well regarded. Operators who pushed it reported the transmission giving problems, and the braking system was inconsistent enough that some operators ran their machines with significant brake deficiencies for extended periods. One account from a contractor described having a 580C with only one functional brake and still using it on hilly terrain, which says less about the operator's good judgment and more about the fact that downtime was more expensive than the risk. The 580C's hydraulic valve body, which contained well over 100 O-rings, was another maintenance nightmare. When those O-rings deteriorated, the hydraulic functions began to bleed into each other. Trying to lift the boom while pulling the dipper would cause the boom to almost stop. Smooth, coordinated multifunction digging became impossible until a full valve body rebuild was completed. And a full valve body rebuild on these machines was not a quick or cheap job. Case eventually addressed these issues in subsequent models. The latter 580K, introduced toward the end of the 1980s, used a cast steel primary boom with a single interior cylinder, a design that operators called virtually bulletproof compared to the earlier welded steel twin-cylinder setup. But for anyone who operated a 580C during its production years, those twin cylinders and the sightline they blocked left a permanent impression. Number 6. The Ford 655. Engine nightmares continue. The Ford 655 was the bigger sibling to the 555, a larger, more powerful backhoe that offered more digging capacity and more loader power. Contractors who needed more capability than the 555 could deliver went to the 655, expecting a step up in quality as well as size. What they often got instead was a step up in repair bills. The 655 shared the fundamental engine lineage problems that plagued the 555 line. Just like its smaller cousin, the 655 models from the early 1980s developed reputations for needing engine work at low hours. In fact, experienced equipment buyers in the era learned to look specifically at 555 and 655 machines and note how many of them had rebuilt motors with relatively low hours on the clock, a dead giveaway that the original engines had given up the ghost well before they should have. One pattern that emerged was the sheer number of 655s available for sale with rebuilt engines. When you see a consistent pattern of the same model consistently appearing on the used market with evidence of major engine work, that tells you something systemic was wrong from the factory. The fuel system on these machines was also a persistent source of headaches. The three-cylinder engines relied on gravity-fed fuel flow without a transfer pump, which meant any restriction, air leak, or contamination in the fuel supply side would cause the engine to run rough, stall out, or fail to start reliably. In field conditions, with fuel tanks that had been sitting, with filter screens that hadn't been serviced, this became an almost guaranteed problem. Hydraulic issues were also common. Owners reported weak hydraulics, a vague but deeply frustrating complaint when you're trying to do actual work. Tracking down whether the problem was the pump, the filter, the suction screen, or a failing valve required methodical diagnosis. And in the 1980s, before internet forums and parts lookup websites, many small contractors were diagnosing these machines essentially by trial and error. Number 5. The JCB 3CX. Early 1980s, British problems on American job sites. The JCB 3CX is one of the most iconic backhoe designs in history. In Britain and across much of Europe, it became the standard by which backhoes were measured. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The early 1980s versions of the 3CX brought a collection of quirks and problems that made American contractors genuinely hostile to the brand, and that hostility lasted for decades. The 3CX of the early 1980s had a fundamental torque converter issue that mechanics and operators of the era described consistently. These machines were just slow. Not slow in terms of digging. The hydraulics and backhoe function were actually fine. Slow in terms of driving. Getting one of these machines moving on a road or across a job site required more patience than most operators were willing to give. When mechanics investigated, they pointed to the stall ratio of the torque converter as the root cause, a characteristic that was apparently just baked into how these machines were spec'd in that era. In testing, experienced backhoe operators noted that early 80s 3CX machines simply would not take off in road gear in any practical way. You'd mash the throttle, the engine would rev, and the machine would inch forward like it was thinking about it. Mechanics who looked at this confirmed it wasn't always a fault condition. It was, disconcertingly, just how the machine was designed. Then there were the transmission drive problems. Numerous 1983, 1984, 1985, 1986, and 1987 3CX machines developed issues where the machine would lose drive power during travel, moving fine initially, then gradually slowing down and losing momentum until it could barely move. The root causes varied: torque converter wear, transmission fluid conditions, blocked cooling passages, but the pattern appeared often enough to define the era. The 1983 3CX also developed a notorious boom drop problem. Operators found that the back actor, the backhoe arm, would slowly drop under its own weight, even when the controls were locked. Ram seals would be replaced, and the problem would persist. The culprit was typically internal valve wear or sticking valves in the control block. Harder to diagnose, harder to fix, and deeply annoying when you're parked on a slope. Parts availability in the United States was another major strike against JCB in this era. JCB was a British company, and while it had distribution in America, getting parts for an early 80s 3CX in rural America often meant waiting weeks. That was time and money that contractors simply couldn't absorb. The consensus view on forums among operators of this era was blunt. Best to steer clear of older JCBs. Parts and service are very suspect. Number 4. The Massey Ferguson 50C 50D. 1980s. Overlooked and undercooked, Massey Ferguson's presence in the backhoe market is one of the least discussed chapters in construction equipment history. And there's a reason for that. The 50 series backhoes of the early 1980s quietly frustrated everyone who worked with them without ever generating quite enough volume to create real notoriety. The MF50C and 50D were built in the United Kingdom and featured Perkins engines, which were actually not bad power plants when properly maintained. The machines were used predominantly by municipalities, utility companies, and farmers who needed a backhoe but were already invested in Massey Ferguson's agricultural ecosystem. The problems these machines developed were textbook 1980s construction equipment frustrations, hydraulic leaks that were persistent and expensive, transmission shifting issues that emerged as machines accumulated hours, and the particular nightmare of getting parts as MF gradually reduced its footprint in the construction equipment market. By the mid-1980s, finding a dealer who stocked MF backhoe parts was becoming genuinely difficult in large parts of North America. The 50 series also suffered from an ergonomics problem that operators noted immediately. The controls felt dated even by the standards of their time. Working an 8-hour shift on one of these machines was a more physically tiring experience than working a comparable Case or Deere, and operator fatigue translates directly into reduced productivity and increased error rates. What really condemned these machines in the long run was Massey Ferguson's retreat from the construction equipment market entirely. When a manufacturer exits a product line, the aftermarket support evaporates. Finding parts for a 1982 MF50D today is a genuine archaeological undertaking. Number 3. The Caterpillar 416. Early series, 1985 to 1987. Now here's a controversial entry. Caterpillar is an icon. The 416 went on to become one of the most successful and respected backhoe loaders in the world. But, and this is important, the very earliest production versions of the 416 launched in 1985 when Cat first entered the backhoe loader market had a specific and repeatable set of problems that early buyers encountered immediately. Cat introduced the 416 as its first purpose-built backhoe loader, partnering with a Perkins diesel engine for power. The first-generation machines from 1985, 1986, and 1987 developed a recurring fuel system issue that followed a maddening pattern. The machine would start fine, run well for an hour or two, then stall completely. After sitting for 30 to 45 minutes and cooling down, it would start again, only to repeat the cycle. Mechanics tracking this down found the culprit was typically a fuel delivery problem linked to the tank breather system and fuel supply side. When the tank breather became blocked, the fuel tank created a vacuum as fuel was consumed, which progressively starved the engine of fuel until it died. Heat-related expansion made the situation worse as operating time increased, which explained the consistent pattern of running well when cold and failing after extended use. Water separators with excessive water content added to the fuel starvation problem. The early 416's electrical system was another weak point. The transmission solenoid and neutralizer circuit design in first-generation machines had wiring configurations that mechanics described as needlessly complicated for what they were supposed to do. Tracing an electrical fault on an early 416 required access to wiring diagrams that weren't always easy to come by, and the machine's tendency to develop no forward or no reverse conditions due to solenoid or wiring faults meant expensive downtime at exactly the wrong moments. In fairness to Cat, they addressed these issues through successive generations of the 416. By the B and C series, the machine had become genuinely bulletproof by most operator accounts. But the early buyers who gambled on Cat's first-generation backhoe loader paid the price of being the beta testers. Number 2. The Ford 555B. Transmission seal problems. Cold morning blues. We're back to Ford for the second spot, and this time it's the 555B, the successor to the troubled 555A. Ford improved the engine situation somewhat with the B model, but introduced a different problem that became a defining characteristic of these machines: the cold morning transmission nightmare. Owners and operators of the Ford 555B discovered that on cold mornings, the machine simply would not move. You'd start the engine, put it in gear, raise the RPMs, and nothing would happen. No movement. You'd sit there waiting, running the engine, and eventually, after anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes, the machine would finally begin to creep forward. The cause was failing forward reverse piston seals in the shuttle transmission. As these seals aged and stiffened from cold temperatures, they lost their ability to seal properly until the transmission fluid warmed up and the rubber became more pliable. The fluid would slip past the seals until operating temperature was reached, at which point the clutch packs would finally engage. This wasn't just inconvenient. In winter construction, where crews were already fighting the cold and trying to maximize daylight hours, having your backhoe sit useless for 15 minutes every morning while the operator waited for the transmission to decide it wanted to work was a morale and productivity killer. Contractors who ran multiple machines would watch their 555B sitting there while every other piece of equipment was already working. The fix required splitting the tractor, separating the front and rear sections of the machine to access the shuttle transmission and replace the seals. It wasn't impossible, but it was a significant job, and on machines that were heavily used, the seals would deteriorate again within a reasonable number of hours. Owners who went through this repair once found themselves planning for it to happen again. The electrical system on the 555B also generated a constant stream of complaints. Starting problems, relay failures, ignition switch issues, and mysterious no-crank conditions plagued these machines. The wiring layout wasn't particularly elegant, and as machines aged through the 1980s, the combination of vibration, heat, and time caused connections to fail in ways that were genuinely difficult to diagnose without experience. On a cold morning with a transmission that wouldn't engage and an ignition system that was acting up, the Ford 555B could make a grown man reconsider his career choices. Number 1. The JCB 3CX Black Cab Sitemaster. Late 1980s parts nightmare. Coming in at number 1 is the late 1980s JCB 3CX in its black cab Sitemaster configuration. A machine that earned a reputation so specifically terrible among American and international contractors that the phrase "don't buy the JCB" became almost a reflex response on equipment forums for years afterward. The black cab Sitemaster variants, produced in the mid to late 1980s, combined multiple categories of problems into one distinctive package. The engine blow-by issues on these machines were widespread. Operators of well-used late 80s 3CX black cabs routinely found obvious crankcase blow-by, indicating worn piston rings and low compression, a fundamental engine health problem that on a machine of this age and price was a significant undertaking to address. The transmission and drive system problems that defined earlier 3CX models continued, and in some cases worsened. The 1986 and 1987 variants in particular developed the gradual drive loss problem: drive fine for a short distance, then progressively lose momentum until the machine could barely move, torque converter issues, transmission fluid boiling out through the dipstick, clogged transmission coolers. These became routine complaints associated with late 80s 3CX machines. And then there was the parts situation. By the late 1980s, JCB's dealer network in North America was simply not dense enough to support rapid part sourcing. In some regions, the nearest JCB dealer was 200 miles away. For a contractor whose backhoe had just broken down on a critical job, waiting a week or more for a part to arrive from a British manufacturer's limited North American inventory was commercially devastating. Competitors like Case, John Deere, and even Ford had dealer networks that were orders of magnitude more accessible. What cemented the late 80s JCB 3CX black cab's place at number 1 on this list isn't just the number of problems, it's the combination of problems, the parts scarcity, and the sheer word-of-mouth damage the machine did to JCB's reputation in North America. The consensus among contractors who ran these machines was consistent and unambiguous. The backhoe arm itself was strong. The hydraulics for digging were fine, but everything surrounding the drivetrain, the electrical system, and the support network behind it made it a machine that contractors came to genuinely resent. JCB has made massive strides since then and produces world-class equipment today. But in the late 1980s in North America, the black cab 3CX Sitemaster was the machine you warned your friends about at the end of a long, expensive, frustrating day on the job. If you're shopping for a vintage 1980s backhoe and you found this video, you're welcome. If you already own one of these machines and you're still fighting the same problems we described, you have our deepest sympathy. Hit that like button if you found this useful. Subscribe for more heavy equipment history. And drop a comment below if you've got stories from running any of these machines. We'd love to hear what you've been through. We'll see you in the next one.